Eliza Bennet knew the exact sound a belt buckle makes just before it breaks the skin. It was a small metallic click, a sound that made the air in their little house grow cold and heavy, a sound that always came after the silence. And the silence was Frank's favorite weapon. She'd lived 40 years inside that silence, here in the forgotten town of Stone Hollow, Colorado, a place where the wind never stopped screaming and folks pretended not to hear anything else. Her life was a simple, brutal routine. Wake before the sun, milk the cow whose ribs showed through its hide, bake the bread Frank would complain was too dry, iron his shirts with creases so sharp they could cut. Her world had shrunk down to the four peeling walls of this house, a crooked porch step, and a husband who measured her worth in one thing she couldn't give him: a child. 12 years of marriage. 12 years of a barren womb. Frank never let her forget it. He didn't have to use fancy words. He had simpler ones. Useless. Broken. Empty. And when those words weren't enough, there was the click of the buckle. It always happened behind closed doors. Always where the good people of Stone Hollow could shut their windows and turn up their lamps, pretending the screams were just the wind. Because in this town, tradition was a fortress, and the tradition said a man ruled his home. It said a woman's purpose was to obey, and if she failed in that purpose, well, that was her own damn fault. The bruises under her sleeves were a secret everyone knew. The split lip she'd hide at the market was a story everyone had already written. She must have provoked him. She's not praying hard enough. But late at night, lying on the very edge of the mattress so her skin wouldn't accidentally touch his, a tiny voice had started to whisper inside her. It was a faint, stubborn sound. The ghost of the girl she used to be. The one who read books by candlelight and dreamed of teaching. The voice asked a dangerous question. What if this isn't all there is? Tonight, the silence was thicker than usual. Frank had been drinking at the saloon. He'd come home smelling of whiskey and rage, his eyes dark and empty. He sat at the table staring at the wall, not touching the stew she'd made. The silence stretched for an hour, then two. Eliza kept her head down, scrubbing a pot that was already clean. Her hands were shaking. She waited for the scrape of his chair, for his heavy footsteps. She waited for the click. Instead, she heard something else. A faint rumbling from the main road. The creak of wagon wheels. It was an unfamiliar sound. Travelers were rare in Stone Hollow. Frank's head snapped up. His eyes narrowed, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Company," he growled. He stood up, but he didn't move toward her. He moved toward the front door, and Eliza felt a new kind of fear, a cold, sharp dread that had nothing to do with a leather belt, because Frank was at his most dangerous when he had an audience. The Harding wagon smelled of pine, dust, and tired children. Will Harding held the reins, his knuckles white. At 43, his face was a map of hard miles and quiet sorrows, but his eyes still held a spark of hope. He was a widower trying to carve out a life for his 3 kids from a world that wasn't always kind. Caleb, 14, sat beside him, his gaze sharp and watchful. He was a boy becoming a man too fast. In the back, 11-year-old Maggie was telling a story to 7-year-old Tommy, who was clutching a burlap sack full of his favorite rocks like they were treasure. They were just passing through, a quick stop in Stone Hollow for water and supplies before the final push to their ranch. But the town felt wrong. The air was thick with something sour. Men on porches didn't nod a greeting. They just stared, their eyes like chips of flint. Women scurried past with their heads down, as if afraid the sky might fall. "This place gives me a shiver, Pa," Maggie whispered from the back. "We won't be long," Will promised, pulling the wagon up to the town's only general store. He was unhitching the horses when the yelling started. It was a man's voice, a roar full of venom and whiskey. "Eliza, get out here! You think you can shame me?" Will froze. He saw a woman stumble out of a small, weathered house. She was tall but seemed bent, as if carrying an invisible weight. Her dress was faded, her hands trembling. Then the man, big and red-faced, followed her into the street. It was Frank Bennett. "You burned the stew," he bellowed for the whole town to hear. "On purpose, to make me look weak." The woman Eliza shook her head, whispering, "No, Frank, I—" The sound that came next was like a whip crack. Frank's open hand caught her across the face, sending her sprawling into the dirt, and the world stopped. No one moved. The men on the saloon porch kept watching, sipping their beers. A woman hurried her child inside, shutting the door. It was a performance, and everyone knew their part. To look away. To do nothing. Caleb's fists were clenched. Pa! Maggie's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Daddy! He hit her! Will Harding's face hardened into a mask of cold fury. He dropped the reins and stepped down from the wagon. Frank raised his hand again, ready to strike Eliza as she lay in the dust. That's enough. Will's voice wasn't a shout. It was low and flat, but it cut through the street like a razor. Every head turned. Frank froze, his hand hovering in the air. He stared at the stranger, his eyes narrowing. You ain't from around here, Frank sneered. No, Will said, walking steadily toward him, his boots kicking up dust. And if this is how men act in Stone Hollow, I'm glad for it. Frank puffed out his chest. This is my wife. This is my business. When you conduct your business in the street for my children to see, Will's voice dropped even lower. It becomes mine. A new kind of silence fell over the town. This one was different. It was tense, buzzing, dangerous. Eliza looked up from the ground, blood trickling from the corner of her mouth. Her eyes met Will's, and in them he saw a universe of disbelief and a flicker of something he thought had been extinguished long ago. Hope. Frank took a step forward. This is our way. You best get back in that wagon and keep riding, stranger, before this town teaches you some respect. But Will saw something else. He saw the town's sheriff leaning against a post outside his office. He wasn't moving to intervene. He was just watching, a slight smile on his face, as if he was enjoying the show. And Will realized the sickness in this town ran deeper than one bully. It was in the foundation. My family's seen enough, Will said, his gaze locking with Frank's. He didn't back down. He didn't even blink. He slowly turned, walked back to his wagon, and helped his children up. But as the wagon rolled away, Caleb looked back. He saw Frank Bennett staring after them, his face a mask of hate. And standing right next to him, clapping him on the shoulder, was the town sheriff. They weren't just watching, they were allies. And Will Harding had just made an enemy of them both. The silence in the Harding wagon was heavier than any stone. They rode for miles, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of blood in violet. Tommy had fallen asleep, his head in Maggie's lap. Caleb sat rigid, staring back down the trail as if expecting to see riders appear at any moment. Will just drove, his hands gripping the leather reins, his mind replaying the scene in the street, the crack of the slap, the woman falling, the dead eyes of the onlookers, the sheriff's smirk. He had driven away. He had taken his children out of harm's way, just as any good father would. But it felt like cowardice. That night they camped by a creek that whispered over smooth gray rocks. Will built the fire, his movements slow and deliberate. The children huddled close, the chill in the air having little to do with the coming night. It was Caleb who finally broke the silence. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of an accusation. You said real men don't look away, Pa. Will stopped stirring the fire. He didn't look at his son. I know what I said, Caleb. So you're just gonna leave her there? The boy pressed. With him? What would you have me do? Will asked, his voice rough with frustration. Start a war with a whole town? You could have done more, Caleb insisted. Before Will could answer, Maggie spoke, her voice trembling. Why didn't the other ladies help her, Daddy? Why did they all just watch? Will finally looked up, meeting the eyes of his children. He saw their confusion, their disappointment. He had raised them on stories of courage and righteousness, on the memory of their mother who believed in kindness above all else. If he let this go, he wasn't just abandoning a stranger. He was betraying everything he had taught his own children. He was teaching them that when things get hard, you run. He couldn't live with that. The next morning, before the sun had even touched the horizon, Will was saddling his fastest horse. He took his rifle and a coil of rope. Caleb emerged from the tent, his eyes asking the question he didn't dare speak. You're in charge until I get back, Will said simply. A look of understanding, of immense pride, passed over the boy's face. You're going back for her. Will just nodded. He rode hard and fast, avoiding the main road, cutting through the wild country that bordered the town. He tied his horse in a cluster of sycamores and crept toward Stone Hollow like a ghost, using the alleyways and shadows as cover. He found Eliza's house. It was dark, silent, no smoke from the chimney. It looked dead. He waited in the alley until the moon was high and the town was asleep. Then he moved to the back door. He knocked once. A soft, hesitant tap. No answer. He knocked again, a little harder. The silence from inside was absolute. His heart sank. Maybe he was too late. Maybe Frank had... He turned to leave, his mission a failure. But then he heard it, the faintest creak. The back door opened a crack. An eye peered out, wide with terror. Then the door swung open just enough for her to slip through. It was Eliza. She was wearing a thin nightgown, a tattered shawl wrapped around her shoulders. A fresh bruise was blooming high on her cheekbone, dark and ugly in the moonlight. She clutched a small silver locket in one hand, her knuckles white. "I didn't think you'd come back," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I didn't think I could live with myself if I didn't," he replied. He looked past her into the dark house. "Is he drunk?" she breathed, passed out in his chair. "Get your things," Will urged. She shook her head. Her eyes, which had been so empty in the street, now burned with a desperate fire. "I have everything I need." She held up the locket. They moved like shadows through the sleeping town. Every dog bark, every creak of a floorboard sent a jolt of fear through them. But they made it to the trees where Will's horse was waiting. He helped her up, then mounted behind her. As they rode away, the crooked steeple of Stone Hollow receding into the darkness, Eliza risked a glance back at the town, back at the little house that had been her prison, and her blood ran cold. In the upstairs window, a single candle flickered to life. A dark silhouette stood watching them go. He wasn't passed out. He knew. He was letting them run. Because for a man like Frank, the hunt was always the best part. The journey back to Will's camp was a blur of moonlit prairies and silent fear. Every rustle in the grass, every hoot of a distant owl, sounded like the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. Eliza sat stiffly in front of Will on the horse, her body radiating a tension so profound it felt like the air around them might shatter. She clutched the silver locket in her hand, as if it were the only thing anchoring her to this new, terrifying reality. When they finally saw the faint glow of the campfire, Caleb was standing guard, rifle in hand. He lowered it with a sigh of relief as they rode into the clearing. Maggie rushed forward, her face a mixture of worry and awe, and gently helped Eliza down from the horse. Tommy, half asleep, offered her his tin cup of water. "You're safe now," Maggie whispered, tucking a blanket around Eliza's shoulders. Eliza looked at these children, at their open, honest faces, and felt a sob catch in her throat. It was the first act of unconditional kindness she had received in over a decade. But she wasn't safe. None of them were. Back in Stone Hollow, Frank Bennett was not moving with the sloppy rage of a drunk. He was cold, methodical. He didn't just grab his shotgun and round up a few angry ranchers. No, this was a public insult, and it required a public official response. He walked straight to the sheriff's office. The man behind the desk didn't look surprised to see him. He just poured 2 glasses of whiskey. "He took her then," Sheriff Brody said. It wasn't a question. "Took what was mine," Frank corrected, his voice like gravel. "He'll have a day's head start," Brody mused, swirling the liquor in his glass. "Not enough," Frank said. "Not with his kids slowing him down. We'll have him by noon." Sheriff Brody nodded slowly. He was a weasel of a man, with shifty eyes and a perpetual smirk. And he was also Frank's younger brother. In Stone Hollow, the law and the bullies wore the same badge. "I'll get the boys," Brody said, downing his whiskey. "We'll get a posse together. Bring her back where she belongs." He then pulled out a stack of papers from his desk drawer, a warrant already filled out. "And we'll arrest this Harding fella for kidnapping." The posse that rode out of Stone Hollow at dawn was not a clumsy mob. It was made up of trackers, hard men who knew the land, and they were led by 2 brothers who saw this not as a rescue, but as a sport. On the trail, the Hardings and Eliza moved as fast as the wagon would allow. Eliza was beginning to thaw, the terror slowly being replaced by a fragile sense of hope. She watched Will with his children, how he spoke to them with respect, how he listened to their stories. It was a language she barely understood. That afternoon, while they rested the horses, Will noticed the locket she never let go of. "That's a beautiful piece," he said gently. "It was my mother's," Eliza said, her voice quiet. "She gave it to me before she died. Warned me to be wary of men with loud voices and quiet hands." She gave a bitter laugh. "I should have listened." Will's brow furrowed. He felt a strange sense of recognition as he looked at the intricate silverwork. "My wife, my late wife, Mary, had one just like it." A strange look passed over Eliza's face, a flicker of a memory she couldn't quite grasp. But before she could speak, a shout from Caleb shattered the moment. "Pa, over here!" They rushed to the creek where the children had been playing. Caleb was pointing at the soft mud on the bank. There, clear as day, was a fresh horseshoe print, and it didn't match their horses. Then they heard it, the baying of hounds in the distance. They weren't just being followed, they were being hunted. Panic seized the small camp. The baying of the hounds grew closer, an eager, relentless sound that promised violence. "They're too close," Will said, his jaw tight. "We can't outrun them with the wagon." His eyes scanned the terrain, searching for an advantage. He saw it, a narrow rocky pass a quarter-mile ahead, a natural choke point. "Caleb, get your mother and brother into that pass. Hide the wagon as best you can. Stay there no matter what you hear." "What are you going to do?" Caleb asked, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Buy you some time," Will said. He looked at Eliza. "I need you." She stared at him, confused. "You said your father was a hunter," Will said, his voice urgent. "Did he teach you to shoot?" Eliza nodded, her mind racing back to a time before Frank, a time of freedom in the woods with her father. "A little." "A little is enough," Will said, pressing a spare rifle into her hands. "Stay low. Don't fire until I do. Aim for the horses if you can." They took up positions on opposite sides of the trail, hidden behind clusters of rock and juniper. The hounds were getting louder, followed now by the pounding of hoofbeats and the shouts of men. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. Her hands were slick with sweat on the wooden stock of the rifle. The girl who had learned to be invisible, to make herself small, was now being asked to fight. The posse thundered into view. Frank and Sheriff Brody were in the lead, their faces grim and determined. There were at least 10 of them. They slowed as they approached the rocky terrain, sensing a potential ambush. "Spread out!" Brody yelled. That's when Will fired. His shot was perfect, taking the horse out from under one of the riders. The man screamed as he went down in a cloud of dust. Chaos erupted. Eliza squeezed her eyes shut and pulled the trigger. Her shot went wide, kicking up dirt far from any target. But it didn't matter. It showed the posse they were facing more than one gun. The men scrambled for cover, returning fire. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks around them, whining like angry hornets. "Harding!" Sheriff Brody's voice bellowed, echoing off the canyon walls. "We know you're in there. You're wanted, William Harding. Wanted for the murder of your wife, Mary." The world went silent. Eliza froze, the rifle feeling heavy and cold in her hands. Murder? Will's face was a mask of shock and pain. He hadn't expected this. Not here. Not now. The accusation hung in the air, more dangerous than any bullet. The posse wasn't just chasing a kidnapper. They were chasing a killer. From his hiding spot, Caleb heard his uncle's words. He looked from the past towards the sound of the gunshot, his heart pounding. The man he idolized, his father, a murderer? It couldn't be true. But the sheriff had said it with such confidence. Frank Bennett started to laugh, a loud, triumphant laugh that chilled Eliza to the bone. "See?" he shouted towards her hiding place. "I told you, you only know how to pick broken things. You ran from a husband to a killer." The posse, seeing the confusion they had sown, slowly began to fall back. They weren't defeated, they were regrouping. They had planted a seed of doubt, and now they would let it grow. As their hoofbeats faded, an unbearable silence settled over the rocks. Will slowly emerged from his cover, his face ashen. He looked at Eliza, his eyes pleading for her to believe him. But all she could see was the face of another man who had lied to her, another man with a dark secret. And far off in the past, Caleb looked at his father, his expression unreadable. The trust that had once been absolute now shattered into a million pieces. They made it to the Harding Ranch under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The small wooden house and weathered barn should have been a sanctuary, but the sheriff's accusation had poisoned the air. The long miles were filled with a tense, brittle silence. Caleb wouldn't look at his father. Maggie kept glancing between Will and Eliza, sensing the new invisible wall that had risen between them. The ranch was isolated, nestled in a valley that offered protection and privacy, but now that isolation felt like a trap. That night, after the children were in bed, Will found Eliza sitting on the porch, staring out into the oppressive darkness. She had the rifle laid across her lap, her posture rigid. "You need to tell me the truth," she said without looking at him. "All of it." Will leaned against the porch railing, the weariness of the past few days and years settling deep into his bones. He told her everything. He told her about Mary, the love of his life, who had been struck down by a fever the doctors couldn't name. He told her about Mary's father, a wealthy, powerful man from back east who had never approved of a simple rancher marrying his daughter. "He blamed me for her death," Will said, his voice thick with old pain. "He said I dragged her out to this wild land, that I neglected her. He has money and influence. It was easy for him to poison the law, to turn a tragedy into a crime. The warrant, it's a lie, but it's a powerful one. We've been running from it for 2 years." Eliza listened, her heart torn. The story felt real. The grief in his voice was undeniable, but she had been fooled by a man's words before. "And the locket?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "How did you know it?" "Mary's father had them made," Will explained. "One for her, one for her sister, who he had disowned years earlier for marrying a poor school teacher. Mary always hoped to find her again." A cold dread washed over Eliza. She thought of her mother, a gentle woman who always seemed to be looking over her shoulder. She thought of her father, the quiet, kind school teacher. She fumbled with the clasp on her locket, her fingers trembling. She opened it. Inside was a tiny faded portrait of a young woman. She held it out to Will. "Is this her?" Will took the locket. He stared at the portrait under the moonlight. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't Mary. It was a younger version of the woman he had just rescued. It was a picture of Eliza's mother. "Her sister," Will breathed, looking at Eliza with stunned realization. "Mary's lost sister was your mother." They weren't strangers bound by a chance encounter. They were family, entangled by a history of loss and domineering men. This wasn't a coincidence. It was destiny, a circle of pain coming to a close. The revelation was so staggering, so impossible, that for a moment they forgot the danger they were in. They were just two souls adrift in the vast darkness, who had just found a piece of a map they didn't even know they were looking for. Their moment of connection was shattered by the sound of a single horse approaching at a frantic gallop. Will grabbed his rifle and Eliza raised hers, their new alliance instantly tested. A figure rode into the yard, slumped over the horse's neck. It was a woman. She slid from the saddle, collapsing into the dirt. Eliza and Will rushed to her side. It was a woman from Stone Hollow, Clara, the blacksmith's wife. Her face was bruised, her dress torn. "You have to run," Clara gasped, clutching Eliza's arm. "They're coming, all of them. Frank and the sheriff. They telegraphed that man, your wife's father." She looked at Will, her eyes wild with terror. "He's on his way, and he's bringing a U.S. Marshal with him." The news hit them like a physical blow. A U.S. Marshal meant the full weight of the federal government was coming down on this small, isolated ranch. There was nowhere left to run. This valley was the end of the line. Clara's arrival was just the beginning. The story of Eliza's escape and Will's defiance had spread through the oppressed households of Stone Hollow like a wildfire. Over the next 2 days, a trickle of refugees became a flood. First came 2 more women, their children in tow, with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Then came a widow whose son had been beaten by Frank for a perceived slight. Then came Mary, the wife of a miner, a woman with calloused hands and a knowledge of explosives. Each woman arrived with a story of quiet desperation, of bruises hidden and tears swallowed. They came to the Harding Ranch not just for safety, but for a glimpse of the impossible. A woman who had said no and lived. The small house was quickly overwhelmed. The barn became a dormitory. The quiet ranch, once a haven of grief, was now buzzing with a desperate, chaotic energy. They were a flock of broken birds, all seeking shelter in the same storm. Will and Caleb worked tirelessly, reinforcing the barn, boarding up windows. But as Will looked at the faces of the women and children, he saw not an army, but a collection of victims. How could they possibly stand against trained lawmen and a posse hungry for blood? It was Eliza who saw it differently. She had spent the first day in a daze, reeling from the revelation about her family and the impending doom. But seeing the other women, hearing their stories, something inside her shifted. The fear didn't vanish, but it crystallized into something hard and sharp. Resolve. She was no longer just running from Frank. She was standing for Clara, for Mary, for all of them. She gathered the women in the barn. Their faces were etched with fear and uncertainty. "I know you're scared," Eliza began, her voice shaking at first but growing stronger with every word. "For years we were told to be quiet, to endure. We were told our pain didn't matter. We were told this was our place, and we believed it." She looked from face to face, meeting their eyes. "But look at us now. We are here. We are together. They are coming for one man they call a murderer. They are coming for one woman they call a runaway wife. But they will not find that. They will find all of us. They will find that we are not just shadows in our own homes. We are a force." Mary, the miner's wife, stepped forward. "My husband taught me how to handle dynamite." Clara, the blacksmith's wife, held up her strong arms. "And my husband taught me how to forge steel." A new energy filled the barn. It was no longer the quiet despair of victims. It was the low hum of rebellion. That night, a new arrival brought a piece of information that changed everything. It was the Sheriff Brody's own wife, a timid woman who had finally reached her breaking point. She found Eliza alone, mending a torn dress for one of the children. "There's something you don't know about Frank," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the shadows. "It's not just that you couldn't give him a child. It's that he already had one." Eliza looked up, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "Years ago, before he married you, a woman from the next town over. They had a son, but the boy was sickly. He died before he was 2. Frank, it broke something inside him. He never forgave the woman. He never forgave the child for being weak. And he never forgave you for not giving him a strong one to replace him." Suddenly, 12 years of cruelty snapped into focus. It wasn't about tradition. It wasn't even just about his ego. It was about a deep, festering wound that he had taken out on her day after day. He hadn't been punishing her for being barren. He had been punishing her for not being able to erase his own past, his own secret failure. The next morning, as the sun rose, a lookout Caleb had posted on the ridge came running. His face was pale. "Riders," he panted. "A lot of them." Eliza, Will, and the others ran to the edge of the valley. They looked east. It wasn't just a posse. It was a small army, a dust cloud miles wide, kicked up by dozens of riders. Leading the charge was Frank Bennett, riding tall in the saddle. Beside him was his brother, the sheriff. And beside the sheriff was a man in a crisp black coat with a silver star pinned to his chest. The U.S. Marshal had arrived. The final battle was here. The valley became a fortress. Under Eliza's surprisingly calm direction, the women and children moved with purpose. Mary, the miner's wife, took 2 other women and began setting subtle traps along the main approach, using her knowledge of fuses and blasting caps not to kill, but to create chaos and confusion. Clara, the blacksmith's wife, organized the reinforcement of the doors and windows, using scrap metal and tools to brace them against attack. The other women created barricades from overturned wagons, furniture, and sacks of feed. Will and Caleb took up positions in the hayloft of the barn, which offered the best vantage point. Their job was to hold the center. The approaching army halted at the edge of the ranch property. The U.S. Marshal, a stern, gray-haired man named Abernathy, rode forward alone, a white flag held high. "William Harding!" His voice boomed across the valley. I am a representative of the United States government. You have a warrant for your arrest on the charge of murder. Come out with your hands raised. Any resistance will be met with lethal force." Silence. "You have 1 minute to comply," Abernathy shouted. Inside the house, Eliza looked at Will's children. She saw the terror in Maggie's eyes, the grim determination on Caleb's face as he prepared to fight alongside his father. This couldn't end in a bloodbath. There had to be another way. She turned to Will. "Trust me," she said. Before he could stop her, Eliza walked out of the house, unarmed, her hands held high. She strode past the barricades and into the open field, her head held high. Frank Bennett spurred his horse forward, a triumphant sneer on his face. "Come to your senses, have you? Ready to come home?" Marshal Abernathy held up a hand, stopping Frank. He eyed Eliza with suspicion. "Who are you, ma'am?" "My name is Eliza Bennett," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the field. "The woman you are here to rescue." She looked past Frank, past the sheriff, and directly at the marshal. "And I am here to tell you that you have been lied to." A murmur went through the posse. "This man," she said, pointing a trembling but resolute finger at Frank, "is my husband. For 12 years he has treated me as his property, as his punching bag. The good people of Stone Hollow, including his brother, the sheriff, stood by and watched. The man you call a murderer, William Harding, is the only one who showed me kindness. He saved my life." "She's hysterical," Frank spat. "The man's a killer. He brainwashed her." "The warrant against Mr. Harding," Eliza continued, her voice rising with passion, "was issued based on the lies of a rich and powerful man who couldn't accept the death of his daughter, a man who happens to be my own uncle." Abernathy's eyes widened slightly. This was getting complicated. "I have proof," Eliza said, pulling the silver locket from her neck. "This proves my connection to the family. This proves this is nothing more than a wealthy man's vendetta and a brutal husband's pride." The marshal was a man of the law, but he was not a fool. He had seen the look in the eyes of the men from Stone Hollow. It wasn't righteousness. It was mob mentality. He looked at Eliza standing alone and defiant, and saw not a hysteric, but a woman speaking a truth so raw it burned. "That's enough," Sheriff Brody yelled. "We're not here to listen to the ramblings of a scorned woman." But it was too late. The door to the Harding house opened again. Clara stepped out, then Mary, then the sheriff's own wife. One by one, every woman who had sought refuge at the ranch emerged from the house and the barn. They walked into the field and formed a silent human wall behind Eliza. Their bruised faces and haunted eyes were a testimony more powerful than any locket. The posse grew restless. The moral high ground they thought they stood on had crumbled into dust beneath their feet. Frank Bennett saw it all slipping away. His wife, his town, his power, everything. The cold, methodical hunter was gone, replaced by a cornered animal. With a primal scream of rage, he drew his pistol and charged his horse directly at Eliza. "You are mine!" he shrieked, his face contorted in a mask of pure hate. Everything happened in a flash. Will raised his rifle from the hayloft. Marshal Abernathy drew his own weapon. But a third shot rang out first. It came from Sheriff Brody. Frank cried out and tumbled from his saddle, clutching a leg that was gushing blood. The sheriff looked at the stunned marshal, his face a mask of false sincerity. "He was out of control, Marshal. I had to stop him." It was an act of pure, craven self-preservation, a brother turning on a brother to save his own skin. And in that single cowardly act, the entire rotten core of Stone Hollow was laid bare for the marshal to see. Marshal Abernathy stared at the scene before him, the wounded, snarling Frank Bennett on the ground, the weaselly sheriff trying to play the hero, the silent, unyielding wall of women standing behind Eliza, and the figure of Will Harding in the hayloft, his rifle now lowered. He was a man who believed in the law, but he also believed in justice, and he knew in that moment that the two were not the same thing. He holstered his pistol. His voice was cold as iron. "Deputies," he said to the two men who rode with him, "arrest that man." He pointed at Frank. "For assault, attempted murder, and anything else you can think of." Then he turned his gaze to Sheriff Brody. "And arrest this one for conspiracy, abuse of his office, and being a goddamn embarrassment to the badge. Brody's face went white. But I helped you. You helped yourself, Abernathy said with disgust. He dismounted and walked toward Eliza, picking up the warrant for Will's arrest that had fluttered to the ground. He looked at it for a long moment. Then, with deliberate slowness, he tore it into pieces. As far as I'm concerned, he said, letting the pieces of paper drift away on the wind, this was a family dispute, and it's over. He tipped his hat to Eliza. Ma'am. He turned and left, his deputies hauling a screaming Frank and a sputtering Brody with them. The posse from Stone Hollow, their courage gone without their leaders, simply melted away, riding back over the ridge in shamefaced silence. And then there was peace. The valley, which had braced for a war, was suddenly profoundly still. The only sound was the wind rustling through the tall prairie grass. Eliza stood, chest heaving, as the women behind her began to weep, to embrace, to laugh with the sheer, giddy relief of it all. It was over. They were free. Will climbed down from the loft, his face smudged with dirt, and walked toward her. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes full of an emotion she couldn't quite name. It was more than gratitude. It was awe. You did it, Eliza, he said softly. No, she corrected, looking back at the community of women, at the children now running out from the house, at the ranch that had become their sanctuary. We did. In the months that followed, the Harding Ranch was transformed. It was no longer just the Harding Ranch. The women choosing to stay built new cabins on the ridge overlooking the valley. They planted gardens. They started a school for the children in the barn. They called their new home the Ridge, a place built not on the laws of men, but on the principles of mutual respect and shared strength. Eliza, once the ghost of Stone Hollow, became its heart. She taught, she organized, she mediated. She didn't lead with a loud voice or a heavy hand, but with the quiet, unshakable strength of someone who had walked through fire and emerged whole. One evening as the sun set, casting a golden glow over their valley, she stood with Will on the porch of the main house, watching the smoke curl from the chimneys of the new cabins. I used to think my life was a curse, Eliza said, her voice soft, because I couldn't create life. I was barren. She turned to him, a slow smile spreading across her face. But I was wrong. I just needed to build a different kind of family. Will reached out and took her hand. His touch was warm and steady, a promise. What now? He asked. Eliza looked out at the land, at the homes, at the women and children who were finally safe, finally free. Her gaze was clear and full of a light that Frank Bennett had never been able to extinguish. Now, she said, squeezing his hand, we grow. They say the American West was won with gunpowder and steel, built on the backs of hard men. But on a quiet ridge in Colorado, a new chapter was written. It was a story of women who were told they were worthless and chose to be priceless. A story that proves the strongest fortresses aren't made of stone and wood, but of courage and community. And if you listen closely, you can still hear their voices on the wind. And they're not screaming anymore. They're singing. If you believe that the toughest trails sometimes lead to the most beautiful places, and that a person's real strength is measured by the number of times they stand up after being knocked down, well then, you've found your campfire. We tell the stories that get left in the dust right here. So hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because there's always another story riding in from the horizon, and you won't want to miss it.